Charles, William, Catherine, Camilla, and the three children sat down to what was intended as an ordinary private family luncheon at Windsor. The conversation remained carefully light, guided by Camilla's deliberate efforts to keep the tone neutral after months of underlying strain. Then, almost without warning, the entire gathering fractured over one word. Camilla referred to herself as belonging to the children's grandparent generation. 9-year-old Charlotte looked up and answered with surgical precision. She already knew who her grandmothers were, she said, and she would not call Camilla by that name. No one raised a voice. No one rushed to intervene. The silence that followed was absolute and prolonged. In that silence, every adult present understood that a deliberate boundary had been drawn and that Camilla had felt its full force. Charles, both grandfather and monarch, asked the expected question in a quiet voice, heavy with authority. He sought an explanation that might allow the moment to be smoothed away. Charlotte replied that certain family names must be earned by the way a person makes another feel. She then asked permission to leave the table. Catherine nodded. The scrape of the chair against the floor became the loudest sound of the afternoon. Camilla remained motionless. Charles looked toward William, recognizing that no royal command could reverse what had just occurred. William did not correct his daughter. He watched her with careful attention, an instinct that revealed far more about the true origins of the episode than any formal rebuke could have done. Catherine followed Charlotte into the corridor. There, the deeper story emerged. The luncheon remark had not been an isolated impulse. Weeks earlier, a private encounter had left Charlotte carrying a quiet injury. What the palace might have dismissed as one uncomfortable sentence now revealed itself as the visible consequence of something that had been accumulating for months. For Charlotte, the issue was never primarily about a title. For Camilla, the refusal of that title struck at the heart of her long effort to secure a place of genuine belonging within the family. Catherine sat with her daughter and asked, without reproach, what the word grandmother actually meant to her. The answer came slowly. Trust, safety, stories, the sense of being protected rather than managed. Charlotte had grown up surrounded by titles that shaped public duty and private identity, yet family language carried a different weight for her. Catherine recognized the distinction at once and refused to convert her daughter's feelings into a performance. In another room, Camilla spoke to Charles of the particular wound she felt. She could endure hostile headlines and years of public comparison, she said, but she could not pretend that rejection from his granddaughter held no meaning. Charles attempted reassurance, yet hesitated before claiming that Charlotte would eventually come around. That hesitation cut more deeply than he intended. William later found Catherine and asked the question both of them had delayed. Had Charlotte mentioned Diana? Catherine confirmed that their daughter had grown increasingly curious about the grandmother she had never known, especially after examining photographs and hearing her father's recollections. Yet the rejection of Camilla was not born of an idealized image of Diana. During the private conversation after the luncheon, Charlotte had described an earlier exchange in which she felt Camilla had dismissed something of emotional importance to her. William paused outside his daughter's door, hand on the handle, before entering. He understood that the matter was no longer one of royal harmony. His daughter had been drawn into an adult history she had not created. Charlotte explained that everything had changed during a private family heritage gathering at Windsor weeks earlier. There had been no raised voices, no dramatic departure. There had been only a quiet room, a photograph of Diana, and a single sentence. William had kept the memories of his mother simple and personal, speaking of her warmth without using the past as a weapon. Charlotte paused beside one photograph and quietly referred to her as Grandmother Diana. Camilla entered, heard the words, and after a brief hesitation told the child she should not become too attached to people she had never known when she already had family around her. The sentence was calm. Its effect was not. Charlotte closed the album and asked whether they might continue another day. William recognized at once that something fundamental had shifted. William later told Camilla that Charlotte was old enough to register tone, yet far too young to carry the weight of decades of family pain. Camilla insisted she had only wished the child to remain grounded in the present. Catherine, however, eventually learned of a second moment. Charlotte had left the room, then returned quietly because she had forgotten a bracelet. Before entering, she overheard Camilla telling an aide that constant references to Diana could become confusing for the children. To Charlotte, the meaning was unmistakable. Remembering her grandmother was becoming a difficulty that others preferred to manage. She carried the hurt in silence for weeks, never confronting Camilla, never demanding explanation. She reached a private conclusion. If accepting one grandmother required weakening the place of another, she would refuse the newer name entirely. William did not summon advisors or call a formal meeting. He asked Camilla to speak privately and made clear that there would be no discussion of Charlotte's manners until the earlier events were addressed. He kept Charles out of the room deliberately, knowing the monarch's presence would turn the exchange into a question of rank. This was not about hierarchy. It was about who possessed the right to define a child's private feelings. William recounted the photograph, the bracelet, and the overheard remark. He asked whether Camilla had told Charlotte that remembering her grandmother was confusing. Camilla answered carefully that the comment had never been intended for the child to hear. William replied that intention does not erase impact. Charlotte now believed that accepting Camilla emotionally would constitute a betrayal of Diana. Camilla's restraint finally gave way. She spoke of years spent being measured against a woman who had died long before the present family structure took shape. Every recollection of Diana, she admitted, could leave her feeling that no emotional space remained for anyone else. She had reacted poorly because she feared Charlotte's growing attachment to those stories would become yet another comparison she could never win. William listened without retreating. His daughter, he said, had never asked Camilla to compete. He then drew the boundary with clarity. No one would forbid Charlotte from caring for Camilla, and no one would encourage hostility. Yet no one would command the girl to use a family word she did not mean. When Camilla asked whether this was merely his opinion or a new household rule, William answered that for his children, he and Catherine decided. Charles learned of the exchange within the hour and asked to meet his son alone. Camilla had expected the king's authority to restore order. Instead, Charles faced a choice that no crown could simplify: protect his wife's dignity or recognize his son's right to protect his daughter. He could direct where Charlotte stood, which ceremonies she attended, and how members of the household formally addressed the queen. What he could not do without consequence was order his granddaughter to feel a bond she did not feel. Meeting William without aides or secretaries, Charles began by describing the dispute as a threat to family unity rather than a challenge to Camilla's rank. William made clear that Charlotte would observe all required protocol and show proper respect. The word grandmother, however, belonged to private affection, not constitutional duty. Charles acknowledged that the refusal had wounded Camilla more deeply than she had expressed. William did not dismiss that pain, yet answered at once that Charlotte had been wounded first. The child had been too young to understand decades of royal tension and had possessed no power when an adult made her feel that remembering Diana was somehow disloyal. Correcting her now, William insisted, would teach the wrong lesson, that the strongest person in the room may define everyone else's emotions. Charles asked whether Catherine supported the position. William confirmed that they had decided together. Charlotte would use Camilla's proper royal form of address when protocol required it, yet privately, she would never be ordered to call her grandmother. The same freedom would be extended to George and Louis. After a long silence, Charles removed his glasses and stated that he would not compel Charlotte. The decision was quiet. Its meaning was considerable. Royal structure remained under his authority, yet William and Catherine retained control over their children's emotional upbringing. Charles believed the matter could still remain behind closed doors. That belief did not last. When Camilla learned he would not overrule William, her behavior shifted. Staff began to notice her absence from private gatherings she would ordinarily never miss. The first consequence was not a statement, but an empty chair. Camilla withdrew from a family tea at which Charlotte was expected, telling Charles she saw no purpose in creating another uncomfortable encounter. Catherine feared Charlotte would blame herself. William suspected the withdrawal functioned as a form of pressure. Charles watched his wife retreat from the very people she had spent years attempting to join. Formal duties continued, yet private invitations became different. Every absence now felt deliberate. Charlotte noticed the empty place setting at the family tea and asked, in a quiet voice that carried more weight than any adult expected, whether Camilla had stayed away because of her. Catherine did not deflect or soften the moment with empty reassurance. She answered firmly that adults remain responsible for their own choices and their own feelings. Charlotte was not required to repair every person around her simply because she had spoken with honesty. The distinction mattered. A child who had already carried weeks of private injury should not be asked to shoulder the emotional consequences of an adult's decision to withdraw. Catherine made certain Charlotte understood that the empty chair belonged to Camilla's choice alone. The girl looked relieved for a moment, yet the relief did not last. She asked whether the queen was angry. Catherine replied that hurt and anger are not the same thing, and that one does not automatically produce the other. The answer left Charlotte quieter than before. She accepted the explanation, but the knowledge that her words had produced visible absence settled somewhere deeper than simple regret. Later that same evening, Camilla sat alone with Charles and told him she felt reduced to someone who must inquire whether the grandchildren were comfortable before she could enter a room. The admission revealed revealed how far the original refusal had traveled. What began as a single sentence at a luncheon table had become a question of presence itself. Charles listened without the defensive instinct he had shown earlier. For the first time, he did not simply defend his wife's pain. He told her that staying away would not create the trust she sought. Withdrawal might shield her from another difficult encounter, yet it also placed emotional weight back upon the child who had never asked to carry it. The repair, he said, must begin without any expectation that the word grandmother would ever be spoken. The statement marked a quiet turning point. The king, who had once hoped the matter could be resolved by authority, now recognized that authority had already reached its limit. William learned that Camilla was considering missing an upcoming private birthday gathering as well. The information hardened his concern at once. If every absence continued to follow Charlotte from one room to the next, the child might begin to believe she controlled whether adults appeared or disappeared. That belief was precisely the burden he and Catherine had worked to prevent. A 9-year-old should not be left with the impression that her private feelings possessed the power to rearrange the family's presence. Catherine agreed, yet she also noticed something unexpected in her daughter. Charlotte was not pleased by Camilla's absence. The girl did not celebrate the empty chair or treat it as proof of victory. She simply registered it as another form of distance that had not been of her making. Camilla herself returned briefly after the tea had ended. She stopped beside the untouched place setting prepared for her, rested one hand on the back of the chair, and never sat. The empty seat, which had once felt like protection, now felt closer to surrender. Charlotte had refused a word, not a person. Once William understood that distinction with full clarity, he encouraged a private conversation between the two of them. No king would sit between them. No future king would speak for either side. Catherine would wait elsewhere. Charles would remain deliberately absent. The arrangement was deliberate. Reconciliation, if it was to occur at all, had to begin without the machinery of monarchy surrounding it. Charles told Camilla the same thing before she entered the room. The conversation must begin without conditions. A royal title is a formal style used in public duty. A family name carries private emotion. For once, those two worlds would be kept carefully apart. The decision to allow the meeting rested on a single condition from William. Nobody would use the conversation to demand an apology or force a new name. Charlotte had already stated her boundary. The adults would respect it. Charlotte brought the same photograph of Diana that had stood at the center of the earlier injury. She placed it on the table between them and told Camilla, without drama or accusation, that she had believed the Queen wanted her to stop caring about someone important to her father. The words were simple. Their effect was not. Camilla did not interrupt. She admitted that the photograph had touched an insecurity she should never have placed upon a child. Hearing Diana discussed could make her feel as though she would always be measured against a memory she could never equal. The admission cost her something. For years, she had carried an adult fear into every mention of the late princess. Yet the child sitting across from her had only been asking questions about her own family. Charlotte answered without anger. She said she had never asked Camilla to compete. The sentence disarmed the older woman more effectively than any formal rebuke could have done. Camilla finally saw how much history had been pushed onto a child who had never asked to inherit it. She apologized directly. She said she had been wrong to suggest that Charlotte could become too attached to someone she had never known, and wrong again to describe those memories as confusing. She did not ask for the word grandmother. That omission mattered more than any of the carefully chosen sentences that preceded it. Charlotte accepted the apology. She stated that she still preferred to use Camilla's name in private and the proper royal title on formal occasions. The Queen agreed. As Charlotte reached the door, she paused, turned back, and asked whether Camilla would come to the upcoming family birthday gathering after all. For the first time, the invitation was personal rather than ceremonial. Camilla, caught off guard, said yes. They had found a private peace. The public knew nothing of the conversation. That ignorance would soon shape the next misunderstanding. The public never heard the private conversation that had taken place without advisors or protocol. It saw only a smaller and more visible gesture. Outside Windsor, cameras recorded Charlotte stepping from a family gathering, pausing beside the Queen, and offering her hand rather than the embrace that observers had come to expect. Within hours, the image dominated broadcasts and front pages. Outsiders interpreted interpreted the handshake as rejection. Inside the family, the gesture represented the careful middle ground they had agreed could exist. William knew every movement would be examined before the family even arrived. Catherine knew it as well. Rumors had already begun circulating around Windsor, and photographers waited for any sign that private tension had become public. This particular gathering carried a second burden. People were no longer watching only for duty. They were watching Charlotte. Her parents refused to stage affection for the cameras. They gave her one instruction only: be respectful and be yourself. Camilla felt the pressure the moment the images began to spread. One front page ran the photograph of Charlotte extending her hand beneath the words, "The Royal Distance." Television panels replayed the missing embrace again and again, treating it as evidence that the family rupture had deepened. Near Windsor Castle, a crowd watched the royal cars depart. Some applauded the young princess for standing her ground. Others argued that no child should become the center of an adult conflict. Within hours, one private boundary had become a national argument. Camilla saw the headline and felt the humiliation settle. Charlotte had been polite. The handshake was not punishment. It was the measured middle ground they had agreed upon. Yet public interpretation transformed that progress into apparent rejection. Charles immediately considered whether the palace should issue a clarifying statement. William objected. Any explanation of Charlotte's feelings, he argued, would expose his daughter to further scrutiny and force private emotion into public debate. The child had already carried enough. Camilla surprised them both. She agreed with William. The Queen told Charles that Charlotte should not be used to repair her image, even if silence left the newspapers free to misunderstand them. That choice changed something important. For the first time, Camilla protected the boundary instead of fighting it. The woman who had spent years seeking acceptance inside the family now chose to shield the child from becoming a public instrument of her own rehabilitation. Charlotte later saw the newspaper beside William and asked whether she had embarrassed Camilla again. Her father answered that respectful honesty is not cruelty. Adults, he said, must stop demanding that children perform feelings simply because cameras are watching. The headlines called the moment rejection. The palace feared division. Yet the real verdict would arrive quietly, inside the family, when Charlotte and Camilla met again with no cameras waiting outside. In the days that followed, the public continued to debate the meaning of a handshake, while the private understanding between the two of them remained intact. Camilla had accepted that the word grandmother would not be forced. Charlotte had accepted that respect could exist without the demand for intimacy. The space between those two positions was narrow, yet it held. Charles watched the public reaction with the careful distance of a man who had spent a lifetime measuring every gesture against the weight of the crown. He understood that any attempt to explain the handshake would only deepen the scrutiny already placed upon his granddaughter. William and Catherine held the line they had drawn. The child would not be required to perform affection for the sake of headlines. The adults would absorb the misunderstanding. Charlotte never withdrew the sentence spoken at the Windsor luncheon. She demonstrated something more lasting than retraction. She proved that refusing a title need not mean refusing a relationship. Camilla, after weeks of hurt and defensiveness, accepted a parallel truth. Belonging cannot be manufactured by royal position, and affection becomes weaker when it is demanded. At a subsequent private family gathering, Charlotte arrived beside William and Catherine with no special instructions waiting for her. Charles entered with Camilla, and this time the Queen did not hesitate at the door or question whether she should stay. No advisors managed the seating. No one prepared a careful reunion designed for appearance. When private conversation began, Charlotte used Camilla's name naturally. Later, when the occasion required formality, she used the proper royal title, the official form of address required by rank and duty. The difference was small, yet it proved something powerful. Respect does not have to pretend to be intimacy. Camilla no longer waited for the word that had caused the original fracture. The absence of that expectation changed the atmosphere of the room. Charles noticed the shift and finally relaxed, not because his wife had secured the title once hoped for, but because bitterness no longer governed the conversation. William saw it as well. For the first time in weeks, the future king no longer stood prepared to defend his daughter from the next emotional blow. Catherine understood what the adults had missed from the beginning. Charlotte's refusal had forced the family to confront Diana's memory without treating it as a threat. The younger generation had not created the conflict by remembering. The older generation had carried fear about what those memories might signify. The gathering required no performance. It simply allowed presence. Camilla stopped waiting for the word that had once seemed essential. Instead, she asked Charlotte about a detail the young princess had mentioned during their private conversation. The question caught Charlotte off guard. guard. She realized she had been remembered. More importantly, she felt listened to rather than managed. The distinction was decisive. For weeks, Charlotte had carried the quiet knowledge that her feelings about Diana had been treated as a problem requiring management. Now an adult asked a question that required no correction and no redirection. The moment was small. Its meaning was not. Charles noticed the change in the room and allowed himself to relax further. The tension that had once tightened every private gathering had loosened enough for ordinary conversation to resume. William no longer watched the exchange with the readiness of a man prepared to intervene. Catherine observed the same shift and recognized its source. Camilla had finally accepted that she did not need to replace Diana in order to build something genuine with Charlotte. And Charlotte had learned that protecting the grandmother she had never known did not require punishing the woman standing before her. The two positions no longer stood in direct opposition. They occupied adjacent space. As the gathering drew to a close, Charlotte paused beside Camilla and asked whether she would come to another family occasion the following week. There was no forced embrace, no demanded title, and no grand declaration designed for witnesses. The Queen simply replied that she would like that very much. The invitation and the acceptance required nothing more than the willingness to continue. That became the lasting meaning of the refusal spoken at Windsor. Charlotte never called Camilla her grandmother, yet by the end she no longer needed rejection in order to defend the people she loved. The family stopped fighting over a word and finally began building a relationship that could survive without it. What remained was not triumph or defeat, but a narrower and more durable arrangement. Camilla continued to feel the occasional sting when the past was mentioned, yet she no longer treated those moments as threats that required silencing. Charlotte continued to reserve the word grandmother for the woman she knew only through stories and photographs, yet she no longer used that reservation as a wall. Charles, who had spent a lifetime measuring every decision against the weight of the crown, discovered that even a sovereign cannot command private affection without damaging the bonds he hopes to protect. William and Catherine held the line they had drawn from the beginning. They protected their daughter's right to feel what she felt while still teaching her the difference between private honesty and public respect. Diana remained exactly where she had always been in Charlotte's mind, a presence made of memory, photographs, and the quiet certainty that love does not disappear simply because the person is gone. The family moved forward not by erasing the past or forcing the present, but by allowing both to exist side by side without one having to defeat the other. The original fracture had forced 3 generations to confront the difference between ceremonial loyalty and genuine family trust. In the careful, imperfect way that only real families can, they began to live inside that difference rather than fight it. The word that once shattered an afternoon at Windsor was never reclaimed. The relationship that grew in its absence proved stronger than the demand that had once seemed essential.